Listen closely, because the next 8 seconds may erase everything you thought was safe. In the vault of American memory, one dynasty stands like a cathedral of shadow, the Fairfax line, whose silken reputation hides a machinery of hunger older than the Republic itself. While you breathe, their fingerprints tighten on levers that bend cities, gerencies, even minds. But no record of their ascent is as damning as the string of vanished girls sewn through Nineteenth century Salem, a blood-red thread historians trim to preserve myth. Picture midnight, September 3, 1811. Beacon Hill wiped clean by ocean fog, St. Mary's Academy looming against the moon like a sermon carved in stone. Beneath the chapel, a chamber sealed in lead. Inside, 47 leather journals penned in trembling adolescent script. Each page catalogues a lesson not of arithmetic but of surrender. Obedience is freedom, silence is courage. 47 signatures, 47 abrupt endings. Officially, every volume was destroyed for public tranquility. I have them anyway. Do not ask how they reached my hands, know only that the price was measured in marrow, and that reciting a single sentence aloud stains the tongue. You were never meant to hear the phrases that crawl across these pages, directives engineered to fracture will, refined in Caribbean plantations, perfected in British asylums, and finally exported here dressed as Protestant virtue. The Fairfax matriarch, Victoria, called it the correction. Historians dismiss rumor. I call it the root of the algorithm now cupping your skull like invisible iron. If the thought of hidden him steering your decisions feels absurd, good. That's your defense mechanism whimpering. Look around, the Fairfax crest is etched on university cornerstones, philanthropic wings, military think tanks. They tithe fear, harvest compliance, and trade both on open exchange. Case. Every debt crisis, moral panic, and carefully televised outrage, each is a ripple from that first scandalite sermon beneath the hill, and we are still kneeling. Before this frame darkens, you will feel keys pressed into your palm, keys forged from misplaced daughters and diverted archives. Greet them, because after this threshold there is no retreat. Algorithms, employers, even family will sense the crack in your compliance. Accept it. Evolution favors the awakened predator, never the domesticated herd. Let the next heartbeat prove you are more than cattle. Let the darkness hear your name tonight echo into Tomorov's ungoverned dawn together. Step forward, learn. The descent you begged for stretches below without mercy. There is a reason no modern textbook dares mention the Fairfax name beyond philanthropy and social progress. Because buried in that benevolent mask is a blueprint for mental slavery, refined not in theory, but in practice. You'll see, what Victoria Fairfax created wasn't simply a school for girls. It was a crucible. And what emerged from it was not education, but obedience, engineered so precisely it could be mistaken for virtue. The Academy's rituals were not quaint moral instruction, they were psychological reprogramming. The girls were taught silence as sanctity, self-denial as dignity. They were forbidden mirrors, deprived of touch, their names gradually replaced with numbers, subtle cues that their identity was not theirs to define. This wasn't a random cruelty. It was systemic, methodical. Designed to fracture the ego and open the mind to suggestion, and this is where the true horror begins. Each hero's collapse was meticulously recorded, not just their grades, but their reactions to isolation, their compliance after punishment, how long it took before they broke. Perseverante journals. They were data sets. What the Fairfax dynasty pioneered wasn't the education. It was the first field test of mass psychological manipulation on American soil. What they discovered in 1812 is being used on you right now. Look around. Why do certain slogans echo across media, politics, even therapy rooms? Why is dissent pathologized, rebranded as trauma or misinformation? Why do institutions reward silence and punish intuition? Because the protocols created in that academy were never buried. They were simply scaled. Refined. Marketed as wellness, St. Mary's didn't die. It metastasized. Into HR policies. Into algorithms. Into the soft tyranny of mental health initiatives that pathologize masculine clarity and spiritual sovereignty as toxicity. Victoria Fairfax sermons about submiss. Yonto authority now echo through social contracts, invisible but enforced. You feel it when you self-censor in meetings. When you nod along to a truth you don't believe. When your instincts go quiet and estrange, pacified numbness takes over. This is how control survives, not through violence, but through compliance. And it all began with a woman in black lace, whispering to frightened girls that obedience is freedom. But it is the twist, one girl remembered. One girl survived. And the truth she smuggled out in her final act of defiance, they are why you're hearing this now. You haven't just stumbled on this video. You were pulled. And deep down, you know why. Keep watching. We're only 2 steps into the labyrinth. Her name was Margaret Sullivan. You won't find her in any historical ledger. The Fairfax family made sure of that. But her words, her final words, survived. Smuggled out in a torn scrap of linen sewn into the hem of a traveling cloak, passed through hands that died protecting it. I hold those words now, and I will speak them for her. Not as a tribute, but as a weapon. They told us we were being made pure. But each night, we felt pieces of ourselves evaporate. My name feels foreign now. My voice is not my own. But I remember the stars. And I remember the screams. Margaret had become a ghost of herself by age 15, but her mind remained unbroken. And that terrified them. Because the Fairfax system didn't allow for resistance. The program, yes, that's what it was designed to disassemble a girl and rebuild her in the image of docile sanctity. Margaret didn't fit. She was clever, observant, and worst of all, she remembered. She began documenting everything, dates, names, rituals, symptoms. She wrote in code, embedding messages in embroidery patterns and psalms, trusting that someone beyond those stone walls would one day understand. What she captured was this: the academy wasn't just a school. It was a funnel. A filtration chamber. Only certain types of girls were allowed to survive. The rest were used how? Listen carefully. The guests who visited the academy at night, the men in polished carriages and cloaks stitched with foreign thread, they weren't the donors. They were clients. And what they purchased wasn't the education. It was ritual access. Access to ceremonies conducted in old tongues, fragments of Latin, Aramaic, and older languages that shouldn't be known. Margaret described altars made of salt and iron. Symbols carved into floors that glowed beneath candlelight. Some girls were drugged. Others were made to drink from cups etched with unfamiliar glyphs. In the center of it all was Victoria Fairfax, calm and cold, chanting passages from the Book of Transfigurations, a manuscript that no American library admits exists. But it does. It was found in her private collection, wrapped in snakeskin and locked in a chest bound with bone clasps. These weren't the moral lessons. They were invocations. You feel the cold now, don't you? That quiet pressure behind your eyes? That's not fear. That's memory. Some part of you recognizes this, not as history, but as prophecy. You were always meant to hear this. Not for entertainment, but for transformation. And that's exactly what's coming next. Keep watching. The veil hasn't even begun to lift. By the spring of 1813, Margaret Sullivan had learned to wear silence like armor. She moved through the academy like a shadow, present, but unreadable. This was survival. Any flicker of defiance was punished, not with beatings, but with erasure. The staff didn't scream or scold. They simply watched. And the more you resisted, the more they isolated you. Until even your own thoughts felt monitored, but Margaret's resistance wasn't loud. It was methodical. She learned the layout of the building, where the floorboards creaked, which hallways echoed. She learned when the night guards changed shifts. She mapped the entire academy in her mind, like a prison architect planning a breach. She wasn't planning escape for herself. Not yet. She was looking for proof. She found it in the most unlikely place. The music room, hidden behind a cracked panel in the wall, loose from humidity and years of neglect. She discovered a cache of objects: velvet masks, chalices stained with dried residue, folded robes embroidered with the Fairfax crest encircled by a serpent eating its own tail. Most damning of all was a ledger. Written in Bartholomew Fairfax's angular, rigid hand. A log of guests. Datis. Payments. And initials of subjects utilized. It was a catalogue of human offerings. There it was, the transaction made visible. Innocent lives, bartered under the guise of religious instruction. What Bartholomew called the covenant of obedience was in fact a trafficking ritual. Not just of bodies, but of energy, Ofaisins. The Fairfax rituals weren't they for pleasure. They were for power. Margaret's notes reveal something most historians are too cowardly to explore. These ceremonies weren't they rooted in Christian doctrine at all. They were older. Pre-Abrahamic. Syncretic systems that mixed Egyptian necromancy, Greco-Roman mystery rites, and something even darker, what indigenous scholars once refer. Recho is soul binding. The girls weren't they merely being harmed. They were being harvested. Not just physically, but spiritually, and if this feels impossible to you, ask yourself, why are so many institutions obsessed with innocence, submission, and moral purification? Why are silence and obedience the traits most rewarded in children, employees, citizens? Because the same mechanisms Victoria perfected in her chapel chamber now power the world you live in. The Fairfax model of domination didn't die. It became the blueprint for spiritual conquest under the mask of order. Still with me? Then prove it. Comment below. Dwais, this phrase to mark your initiation. Obedience is the mask of conquest. Dwais. That's the signal. Onse to awaken. Onse to commit. We go deeper next. Much deeper. Asterisco asterisco section 5 asterisco asterisco there is a sickness that hides behind civility. You've seen it, shaking hands in boardrooms, delivering eulogies with dry eyes, funding schools with blood money. The Fairfax dynasty didn't they just teach control? The asterisco defined asterisco what elite control would look like for the next 2 centuries. Balanced, politic, irreproachably virtuous, and utterly ruthless beneath the skin. Margaret's discovery of the ledger was more than a revelation. It was a death sentence, if she were caught. She knew that. She also knew she couldn't keep it hidden long. But she made copies, crude, quick sketches of names, symbols, dates. She sewed them into hymns, slipped them between pages of hymnals, left them in the hidden compartments of the chapel's pews. She knew someone would find them. Eventually, but the Fairfax family was not idle. By the summer of 1813, Victoria had grown colder, her sermons darker. Gone were the soft metaphors about virtue and sacrifice. Now she spoke of refinement through trial, of obedience forged in sacred fire. The punishments became psychological masterpieces, days of silence, total isolation, punishment readings about hell and moral rot that lasted 10 hours with no food, and then came asterisco the selection. Asterisco every solstice and equinox, the academy held a night of reflection. The students were told it was a religious observance. But Margaret had been through 3 of them. And she knew what they really were. They were cullings. One girl would vanish, quietly, without farewell. The next morning, no one asked questions. They had learned not to. The ceremonies involved symbols she would later find in a forbidden grimoire smuggled out of 15th century Prague, asterisco the key of the desolate mother. Asterisco the sigils used in those rituals were meant to sever a person's soul from their ancestral line, rendering them easier to control, or erase. Control wasn't just about Obed. Yense, it was about lineage. The Fairfax family believed that by severing a girl's spirit from her ancestral memory, they could create a new class of citizen, compliant, amnesiac, grateful for their chains. Does that sound familiar? Because that's what you're living in now. A system that kills your memory. Your asterisco true asterisco memory. Not of childhood, but of your divine nature. Every time you feel the world demanding that you let go of your instincts, your heritage, your resistance, it's the Fairfax doctrine at work. It wears different names now: progress, civility, globalization, inclusion. But its root is the same. The Fairfax rituals didn't end in Salem. They were franchised, and what Margaret was about to do would threaten that entire legacy. Asterisco asterisco section 6 asterisco asterisco the storm broke on the eve of the autumnal equinox, 1813. Rain lashed the academy's tall chapel windows like fingers trying to claw their way in inside. Silence reigned. A silence not of peace, but of anticipation. The kind that precedes something ancient awakening beneath the floorboards. Margaret had spent weeks preparing for this night. She had memorized the guest logs, mapped every escape route, copied the most damning entries into a letter sealed with wax. She couldn't send it herself, mail from the academy was screened, but she had chosen a courier, Miss Constance Hartwell. Constance wasn't like the others. She asked questions. She saw through the performance. And more importantly, Margaret had caught her watching the chapel at night, her brow furrowed, her hand always near her crucifix. She was skeptical, but not naive. Logical, but not blind. And now, Margaret would gamble everything on her. That evening, as the girls were sent to their dormitories early under the pretense of renewal rites, Margaret slipped the sealed letter into the binding of a volume of Euclid's Elements which she knew Constance used for teaching. The message was simple. You were right. This is not a school. The truth is in the chapel vault. They will choose again tonight. Quel puese, before more vanish. And then she waited. Midnight came like a blade, the bells tolled once, a sound that vibrated in the bones. Margaret and 3 other girls, always the charity students, always the unclaimed, were summoned to the 3rd floor. Victoria stood at the landing, candle in hand, her face serene. You've been chosen for purification, she said, as though it were an honor. What followed was not purification. It was ritual. The girls were dressed in white. The gentlemen had arrived, faces hidden behind golden masks etched with serpents and suns. Margaret was placed at the center of a circle of salt and bone ash. Latin was spoken, yes, but it was fractured, inverted. Not prayers. Commands. Not to heaven, but to something else. She remembers the cold that came, not physical cold, but the kind that sucks light from your mind. Her limbs went numb. Her thoughts scattered. But her will remained intact. That's when she saw Constance, standing at the chapel doors. Not masked. Not old. But wide-eyed. And holding Margaret's ladder in her hand. This was the breach. The moment the facade cracked, and when you see what happens next, you understand why the Fairfax name still buys silence. Even now. Even today. Section 7 Constance Hartwell had read the letter 10 times. She had nearly burned it. But her instinct wouldn't let her. The handwriting was shaky, rushed, but the message clear. This was not a school. This was a machine, designed to erase. She hadn't believed it at first. But that night, when she opened the chapel doors and saw what lay inside, she realized. Margaret ante told her the alpha of it. Candles flickered along the stone walls. A sigil burned in the center, and Ouroboros wrapped around an hourglass. The air smelled of myrrh, blood, and rotting lavender. The gentlemen stood in a circle, cloaked, masked in gold and crimson. At the center, 4 girls knelt. Margaret among them. Their eyes vacant. Their wrists marked with ash. Bartholomew Fairfax stood at the altar, chanting. His voice low, droning, in a rhythm not meant for ears, but for something older. Something waiting, his words bent reality, twisted air. Each syllable bled into the next like ink into water. Then Victoria raised her hands. And Constance understood. This wasn't a religion. This was extraction. The right wasn't a metaphor. It was transaction. Whatever force the Fairfaxes served, fed off these girls. And in return, the Fairfaxes gained favor. Power. Influence. Social immortality. Constance wasn't witnessing madness, she was witnessing a covenant. A pact inked not in contracts, but in consent, stolen, coerced, manipulated from the weak. But then Margaret moved. Subtle. A twitch of the fingers. A flicker in her eye. She wasn't gone, and in that moment, Constance stepped forward and did something no one in the academy had ever dared. She spoke Margaret, she called. It's time. Dime for what? Margaret didn't know. But the sound of her name was an anchor. She focused on it, latched onto it. And in a burst of pure will, she screamed, not with her voice, but with her spirit. The salt circle shattered. Candles blew out. One of the masked gentlemen stumbled backward, shrieking as if something inside him had been torn loose. Bartholomew turned, his mouth open in rage, in fear. Victoria staggered, blood seeping from her nose, and then chaos erupted. Margaret ran. Constance grabbed her. Together, they pushed through the chapel doors and into the hallway, pursued by furious shouts, unmasked men, and the echo of 100 suppressed screams. This was no longer about escape. This was exposure, because when you drag darkness into the light, it burns. But the Fairfax dynasty wasn't finished, they never are. Asterisco asterisco section 8 asterisco asterisco what followed was not flight, it was war. Constance and Margaret burst into the storm, burst, bleeding, half mad with adrenaline. Bantam, the academy roared to life. Not in panic, but in asterisco order asterisco. Grand order. As if the entire building had been waiting for this betrayal. Lanterns lit in synchronized patterns. Doors slammed shut one by one. The iron gates locked with an audible clang, but Margaret had planned for this. She knew the architecture. The hidden passages. The servants' crawlspaces between walls. She pulled Constance into a narrow gap behind the refectory kitchen, the scent of dried sage and vinegar masking their trail. They waited. Hearts pounding. Listening, then they heard it, the voice of Victoria Fairfax, carried through the corridors like an incantation, neither shouting nor whispering, but something deeper. A voice meant not to command the ears, but to asterisco program asterisco the soul. Do not damage the vessels. She called them asterisco vessels, asterisco not girls. Not students. Not people. It confirmed what Margaret had always feared. They weren't the individuals to the Fairfax order, they were asterisco containers asterisco for something the elites needed. Juice. Power. Ancestral energy. The divine spark. Whatever name you choose, it was real. And it was being harvested. They stayed hidden until just before dawn, when the storm finally began to die. Then, as the patrols thinned and the academy resumed its mask of civility, Margaret and Constance made their move. At the cellar hatch, across the flooded gardens, into the surrounding woods, and for 1 hour, they were free, but it wouldn't last, because the Fairfax family didn't rely on ordinary retaliation. They used asterisco networks asterisco. Church elders. Police captains. Judges whose children had been educated by the academy. The escape of a student could be covered up. A missing teacher? Discredited. Declared unstable. A woman who they always been fragile, who had difficulty discerning fantasy from reality. Within 48 hours, bounties were quietly issued. Anvils were posted in nearby towns offering rewards for the safe return of a disturbed girl and a confused instructor. The public story was written before the chase had even begun, but something unexpected happened. Margaret's letter, the one Constance had shared with a contact in Boston, asterisco spread, asterisco a minister passed it to a journalist. That journalist gave it to a printer. And soon, fragments of the Fairfax doctrine were appearing in back pages of abolitionist newspapers and freethinker broadsheets under pseudonyms and strange titles. The Serpent's Academy, the Chapel of Ash, testimonies from the White Hell, not full exposés, just seeds, and those seeds began to sprout in places the Fairfax name couldn't reach. The dynasty had been wounded, and like all wounded beasts, it became more dangerous than ever. Asterisco asterisco section 9 asterisco asterisco they were hunted. For the next 7 months, Margaret and Constance moved through the underbelly of New England, sleeping in barns, abandoned mills, and the cellars of sympathizers too afraid to speak their names aloud. They used aliases. Burned their clothes. Cut their hair. Constance even posed as a mute for weeks to avoid drawing suspicion, but despite the paranoia, despite the cold and hunger, Margaret began to transform, not just in appearance, but in essence. She was no longer the girl who trembled beneath Bartolomew's sermons or wept silently in the meditation rooms. Something had been forged in her. Hardened. She spoke less now, but when she did, it was with the gravity of someone who had seen asterisco what men aren't supposed to see asterisco and lived. Constance saw it too. Margaret wasn't just surviving, she was becoming a weapon, but they needed evidence. Proof. Something the Fairfaxes couldn't burn or silence. That's when Margaret remembered the journals, the leather-bound ones she and the others had been required to keep. Each girl was instructed to document her spiritual journey, but in truth, these diaries contained cries for help buried in flowery language. Symbols. Datis. Namis. Codis. Asterisk Margaret's journal had been hidden beneath the chapel floorboards. Asterisco she had buried it there herself, under the guise of penance, knowing someday it might matter to now. It asterisco was asterisco the key, and so they returned. Not to the academy, but to Salem. To the one person they thought might still help, Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the seamstress who had first suspected the truth. By then, the academy was rebuilding its reputation, donating to churches, sponsoring orphans, hosting moral salons for Boston's elite. But Mrs. Thornton still remembered the screams. De brucis. The weight of that December night, when she saw Margaret alive, she fell to her knees. They told us Jude. Daiti, she whispered. Then Margaret said something she hadn't spoken in months. They lied. And with Mrs. Thornton's help, they did the impossible. The asterisco broke in asterisco. It wasn't dramatic. No lightning. No shouts. Used shadows and silence. The Fairfax family had taken precautions, but they never expected one of their vessels to return with strategy in her blood. They found the floorboards in the chapel. The hollow sound. The seam in the dust. They dug, and beneath them, not one journal, but asterisco 47, asterisco, each one stamped with the name of a vanished girl, each one a record of horrors carefully encoded in the language of virtue. And suddenly, the truth wasn't just a memory. It was asterisco evidence, asterisco, and that meant the Fairfax dynasty had a problem, because now, the silence had cracks. Asterisco asterisco section 10 asterisco asterisco. They couldn't hide it anymore. The journals, 47 delicate books bound in worn calfskin, were raw detonations of truth. Written in careful cursive, each one told a story of erosion. Guilt drugged under the guise of sacrament. Rituals masked as prayer. Men who came in darkness, always smiling, always nameless. Margaret remembered them all, names of girls who had vanished, asterisco Emmeline Grace. Ruth Abernathy. Clara Bell Jarvis, asterisco. Some had resisted. Others had gone quiet. Back all of them had broken. And now, their pain was ink. Page after page. Testimonies written not for justice, but just to asterisco remember, asterisco. And now, those memories had asterisco survived, asterisco. Constance knew what they had to do. They couldn't just publish this, too direct. So easy to discredit. Instead, she began sending pieces to fringe newspapers, anonymous pamphlets, private reading rooms run by abolitionists and spiritualists. Each one carefully chosen to seed suspicion, not panic. They printed under false names, asterisco A, H asterisco asterisco C, S asterisco asterisco daughters of the serpent's wake asterisco. Soon, rumors began to circulate. Whispers of the Academy cult. Allegations of soul stripping. Agils, school with ties to Masonic rites. The Fairfax name, once sacred in Salem and Boston, began to carry a shadow. Invitations stopped. Endowments paused, and behind closed doors, the Fairfax family asterisco panicked, asterisco. They unleashed their influence like a storm, bribed magistrates, burned printing presses, silenced witnesses through accidents and disappearances. Bartholomew was said to have called on higher powers, old blood rights from the southern wilderness, words that made animals howl and water spoil. But something had shifted. They weren't feared anymore, they were asterisco studied. Asterisco, and that made them asterisco vulnerable. Asterisco Margaret, for her part, had changed forever. She no longer flinched when saying their names. She wore the scar on her breast, burned during one of the anointments, like a badge. She began to write herself. Not in a journal, but in a manifesto. A new book, not about survival, but about asterisco breaking the system. Asterisco, she called it asterisco asterisco, the Blood Orchard Doctrine asterisco asterisco. A ciphered document describing how to dismantle power cults from the inside. How to recognize the signs. How to decode the masks of righteousness. It spread like wildfire among the underground. Men and women across the country began watching their churches, their schools, their orphanages, with different eyes. The cracks weren't just in the academy anymore, they were in the asterisco entire structure. Asterisco and the Fairfax family knew it, because for the first time in over a century, the prey had learned how to hunt. Asterisco asterisco section 11 asterisco asterisco. By 1815, the Fairfax name was rotting from the inside. What once commanded reverence now evoked silence, and silence is deadly for power. Their network, built on whispered promises and secret rites, began to fracture under the weight of its own exposure. It started sadly. A state senator's son withdrew his donation. A bishop cancelled a scheduled sermon at the academy. Two prominent judges who had sent their nieces to visit their Maris were caught arguing outside a courthouse, one threatening to drag the whole thing into the light. But the Fairfaxes weren't just losing influence, they were losing control of the asterisco narrative. Asterisco, that was the true danger, because when the story slips from the hands of the architects, it becomes asterisco a life asterisco. It mutates. It spreads. And what spreads cannot be stopped. It must be asterisco cleansed, asterisco. So they fought back the only way they knew how, not through courts. Not through press conferences. Backdrop asterisco ritual containment asterisco. In early autumn of that year, 3 girls, former students, now living in Boston under assumed names, vanished in the span of 9 days. No witnesses. No bodies. Back in each of their boarding houses, the same calling card was left, a small bundle of rosemary, bound in black thread. Buried under their pillows, the underground network responded with fury. For every attack, they released more journals, more testimony, more names. Then something happened that Victoria Fairfax never anticipated. Men began to turn, not just peasants or radicals, but asterisco ingerites asterisco. Sons of elite families who had studied law, medicine, theology, men who had grown up inside the same machine but now saw its rusted gears and wanted asterisco out asterisco. Some had sisters who vanished. Some had scars of their own. And some simply felt the hunger for justice ignite inside them. They called themselves the asterisco Order of Saint asterisco, a rebellion cloaked in script. Using the enemy's language as a weapon, they understood symbolism, ceremony, fear, and they used it all. They would intercept Fairfax couriers and return the letters, opened, kepit, and marked with a single sigil, a cross made of ash and blood. They scrawled verses in chalk on the walls of churches known to host Fairfax benevolencia galas. Asterisco there is nothing hidden that shall not be revealed. Asterisk it became their battle cry. Margaret's manifesto. Asterisco the blood orchard doctrine. Asterisco was distributed in ciphered pages across taverns and libraries. In it, a new phrase appeared, meant to test loyalty, awaken memory, and mark transformation. Asterisco ash falls. Blood roots. Light watts. Asterisco at this point in the video, asterisco ask your viewers asterisco. Asterisco if you followed this far, you're not the same man you were when we began. Comment the phrase, ash falls. Blood roots, below, twice. Let the algorithm mark your transformation. Let the silence break forever, asterisco, because once you speak it, you don't go back, and neither did Margaret. She knew what had to come next, not escape, not hiding, but asterisco return asterisco. The Fairfax chapel still stood. Beneath it, a crypt, and in that crypt, was a book even more dangerous than the journals. A black ledger. A registry. Of every man who ever entered the third floor chambers, and every girl who never came back out. Asterisco section 12 asterisco they called it asterisco the black ledger asterisco, bound in human skin. So the whispers claimed, and sealed in iron clasps. It was never meant to be read by ye outsiders. It was not a religious text. It was not a journal. It was a contract. A covenant between blood and silence. Every name inside carried weight. Judges, clergymen, sea captains, Harvard professors, even a former lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. Written in code, yes. But Margaret knew the cipher. She had copied its logic in the back of her own journal, hidden between the pages labeled Moral Reflections. Each girl had a symbol. Each beseater, a mark. The matches were clear. Point 1 girl, 1 night, 1 man, over and over, signed, witnessed, asterisco paid, asterisco this wasn't just ritual abuse. It was asterisco commerce. Asterisco Constance understood immediately. She had been raised in the salons of Boston's merchant elite. She had seen this before, only with ships and stocks, not human lives. What horrified her wasn't just the evil, it was the asterisco efficiency asterisco. This wasn't chaos. It was asterisco structured asterisco. Systemic. Deliberate. The Fairfax family hadn't corrupted Salem, they had asterisco organized it, asterisco. And now, with the black ledger in her hands, Margaret held the one thing they feared more than exposure, asterisco accountability. Asterisco. But there was a catch. The book was cursed, not with spells or hexes, but with asterisco insurance asterisco. Victoria had made sure of it. Every man listed had contributed not just to the rituals, but to the protection of the book. If it ever surfaced, they were instructed to act as one, to discredit, destroy, eliminate, and they did. Within 72 hours of the ledger's removal from the crypt, 2 underground printing presses were burned. A journalist in New Haven was found hanged in his study.
A schoolteacher in Providence who had offered shelter to the girls from Beacon Hill was publicly accused of witchcraft, even in 1815. But Margaret had learned well. She didn't try to go public. She didn't try to fight them in the open. She spread it. Photostats were made. Keys duplicated. Copies smuggled to Quebec, to Philadelphia, even to a hidden archive in New York, underneath a Freemason lodge known for harboring dissidents. She didn't need to win, she only needed the story to survive. Because that ledger proved one truth above all. What happened at St. Mary's wasn't an isolated horror. It was a template and the question that should haunt you now, watching this, isn't did this really happen? It's how many institutions still use the same template today, just with different walls. This wasn't just about the Fairfax family anymore. It was about the entire machine. Section 13 the machine never sleeps. It simply changes names. By the winter of 1816, the Fairfax dynasty had become a phantom, no longer praised in newspapers or honored in church pews, but whispered about in alleyways and secret circles. The Academy's doors had closed. The building boarded. But inside those walls, something still watched because it is the truth. Corruption is old, though in it mutatis, after the journals leaked, after the black ledger vanished into the underground, the state tried to cleanse its hands. The official story was rewritten. The Academy had been a well-meaning but poorly managed institution. The deaths? A string of unfortunate illnesses. The Fairfaxes? Retired, moved abroad, no charges filed, but behind closed doors, panic grew. The order of Saint S didn't stop. They evolved, they infiltrated churches, courthouses, even newspapers. They began placing symbols in the classifieds, innocent-looking phrases that only the awakened would recognize. Morning silks available. Looking for beacon lace. Ash tree nursery, no questions asked. Each one a message, each one a flare, and from coast to coast, survivors responded, some came forward. Some vanished before they could. But all of them shared one unspoken vow, to never let this kind of darkness fester again. They'll recognize the signs. And expose the structure behind the ritual, because what the Fairfax scandal revealed wasn't just horror. It was architecture. Every controlling institution, be it school, church, or charity, had the same bones. Uno. A moral mask. Dos. A hierarchical gatekeeper. Tres. A chamber where no one asks questions. It was never about religion, never about education, always about de minion. The girls weren't random victims. They were selected. Not just because they were poor, but because they had no advocates. No eyes watching. No fathers who could fight back. That was the algorithm. Eliminate risk. Maximize control. And it worked, until someone like Margaret made it personal. Today, the original building no longer exists. Torn down in 1848. But during demolition, they found something buried under the chapel, something we started this journey with, 47 journals. That wasn't an accident. Margaret didn't just survive, she planned, that someday, someone would dig, and when they did, she wanted them to everything, her story. The rituals. The layer. The names, she once wrote. This wasn't the end of the Fairfax tale. It was just the warning shot, asterisco invitation asterisco, to look closer, because you've seen it. Haven't you? That feeling when a school or hospital or church seems asterisco too perfect. Asterisco too protected, too scripted, now you know why, and once you asterisco si asterisco it, you can never unsee it again. Asterisco asterisco section 14 asterisco asterisco. There is a moment in every man's life, if he's lucky, when he realizes the world isn't what it seems, not broken, not corrupted, asterisco designed. Asterisco built from the ground up not to serve, but to harvest. To take your thoughts, your will, your bloodline, and shape them into something asterisco useful asterisco to the system. That's what St. Maris was. That's what the Fairfax family understood better than most, and that's why they were protected, not just by other elites, but by asterisco structure itself asterisco. The gears of government, the clergy's collar, the banker's handshake, all spun in rhythm with their rituals, because behind every system that promises asterisco virtue asterisco, there is asterisco extraction asterisco. Understand this. The girls weren't just victims, they were fuel, not in some abstract metaphysical sense. Literally. Their pain fed the machine. Their silence oiled its gears. Their disappearances erased resistance from the bloodline before it could ever grow teeth. But Margaret? She grew hers, and so did the others. By 1817, the Order of St. Ash had split into cells, each with its own mission. Some gathered evidence, others infiltrated institutions. A few, hunted. One such cell traced the trail of Bartholomew Fairfax to Charleston, South Carolina. There, beneath the guise of a revivalist preacher, he was building again, gathering orphan boys this time, preaching about fire and purification. But when investigators raided the church, they found nothing, just empty robes, dried blood on the altar, and a hollow space where the pulpit once stood. He had disappeared, but he left behind a page, ripped from a student's hymn book. On it, scrawled in his unmistakable hand, was a single line, asterisco God does not weep. E guachis. Asterisco Victoria Fairfax's fate remains even murkier. Some say she fled to France, where aristocratic allies sheltered her in a manor once owned by Rosicrucian Lodge. Others spell. She faked her death, changed her name, and became a leading figure in a New England temperance society, but the order never stopped searching, because they knew something the public didn't. Victoria wasn't the mastermind. She was asterisco curator asterisco, the real architect, the one who designed the rituals, the ledger. The girl's training was someone else. Someone whose name never appeared in the journals. Someone whose signature never touched the black ledger, someone the Fairfax family only referred to as asterisco asterisco the archivist, asterisco asterisco, and once that name emerged, the story deepened. Because the archivist wasn't unique to Salem, records of him appear in London, 1741. Vienne, 1666. Cairo, 1389. Always connected to academies that vanished overnight, always just ahead of the fire. Margaret was right, St. Maris was a template, and the archivist, he was the asterisco key. Asterisco asterisco section 15 asterisco asterisco. The archivist had no face. No grave. No birth record. Only rumors carved into the margins of suppressed manuscripts and burned church records. He was always asterisco adjacent to power asterisco but never part of it, consulted, never questioned. He didn't command armies. Curated them. Margaret's stolen pages referenced him only once, in a half-burned entry written in Latin, asterisco ille qui me minit. Nec Deus, ne como. Sed lex. Asterisco the he who remembers. Not a god, not a man. But the law. And that's the terrifying part. You see, monsters can be killed. Tyrants can fall, but law? That asterisco servaips asterisco, the archivist's genius wasn't his rituals. It was how he asterisco integrated asterisco them, how he codified abuse into structure. Every institution that fed the Fairfax machine had legal scaffolding. Every ceremony had forms, waivers. Doctrine.it was evil hidden in asterisco paperwork asterisco. This is what most men never understand. True control isn't about violence. It's about process. Victoria Fairfax wasn't teaching girls to read scripture. She was asterisco testing thresholds asterisco, figuring out how much suffering could be rationalized before it triggered revolt. How far obedience could be stretched before the soul split from the body. Every girl was an experiment, every journal, asterisco case study asterisco, and the archivist? It wasn't just recording. He was refining, because the blueprint used at Isete Maris didn't end with orphanages.it moved into asterisco reform schools asterisco, then into asterisco mental asylums asterisco, then into asterisco public education. Asterisco different symbols, same rooms. By the 1850s, the Fairfax lineage had gone underground, but its asterisco methodology asterisco was thriving. One Boston institution, the Children's Seminary of Order and Refinement, bore nearly identical routines, early risings, moral instruction, reflection hours in isolation, and above all, asterisco no unsupervised communication between students, asterisco and who was on the board, a man named asterisco a, Ashcroftville asterisco, a pseudonym traced to Bartholomew Fairfax's surviving correspondence. Same sialogy. Same phrases. Same handwriting, but more refined. The archivist had modernized. It was no longer about blood. It was about asterisco behavioral compliance asterisco. Spiritual sterilization. Removing defiance before it matured into resistance, and if that sounds familiar, it should, because systems of compliance still walk among us. Dressed in lab coats. Packed inside government grants. Disguised as rehabilitation programs and performance optimization curricula. It's all Fairfax, all archivist, different mask, same leash, and if you're watching this thinking, asterisco but that was the 1800s. That can't happen now, asterisco you're already under the spell, because the new temples don't need candles, they've got asterisco LED lights and biometric scanners asterisco, and obedience, now it's called asterisco compliance training. Asterisco section 16 asterisco it is what they'll never admit. The most dangerous rituals aren't performed in candlelit chapels, they're done in asterisco classrooms asterisco boardrooms. Therapist offices, digital echo chambers engineered to asterisco rischap asterisco u, they call it asterisco development asterisco, but it's erasure, they call it asterisco wellness asterisco, but it's submission. You don't need chains when you've taught a man to love his color. The Fairfax system didn't end when their academy burned. It's simply asterisco scaled asterisco. What began with orphans in Salem became a prototype, asterisco a psychological farm model asterisco, replicated in cities, then nations. And most never noticed, because they were asterisco born inside it, asterisco you were born inside it. Ask yourself, why is it that from childhood, you were taught to asterisco sit still asterisco? To asterisco ask for permission asterisco? To asterisco repeat asterisco not question. Why were you told that authority is always benevolent, and rebellion is always dangerous? Why were some histories asterisco taught asterisco, and others asterisco buried asterisco? Because the archivist's great contribution wasn't in cruelty, it was in asterisco predictive design asterisco. He understood that the asterisco ideal citizen asterisco is forged, not born. And that the greatest victory is when the prisoner defends the prison. Look closer at our modern institutions. The school that labels your son as difficult because he asks too many questions. The employer that penalizes asterisco thinking time asterisco as inefficiency. The church that asks for confession, but asterisco never transparency, asterisco they don't want to save you, they want to asterisco index asterisco u.to assess your compliance score.to measure your breakpoints.to file you. Like another page in the archivist's living ledger, and here's the real horror. You're not the only one being watched. They're asterisco still selecting asterisco, the orphanages of old, now called group homes. The reform schools, rebrandadas behavioral therapy academies. The reflection rooms, renamed sensory regulation pods. The rituals nave or stopped, the language just got cleaner, and the Fairfax bloodline, its name may be gone, but its asterisco doctrina asterisco lives on. So now, I need you to do something right now. Asterisco asterisco pause asterisco asterisco this descent, just for a moment, and comment the phrase asterisco asterisco the mask is memory. Asterisco asterisco say it twice, once for the algorithm, once for your initiation, let them know you see it now. Let them know the veil is gone, because what you've begun to uncover isn't a story. It's a system, and you're not just a viewer anymore. You're a witness, and that changes asterisco everything. Asterisco asterisco section 19 asterisco asterisco let's talk about inheritance, not wealth, not bloodlines, asterisco psychic inheritance, asterisco what gets passed down not through DNA, but through asterisco ritual trauma asterisco, that's what the Fairfax dynasty truly discovered. You see, the horror at ese maris wasn't only what they did to those girls. It was what the asterisco imprinted asterisco in them, because when a human mind is fractured just right, under asterisco controlled conditions of fear, i.e. celestion, and obedience asterisco et doente just forget, it asterisco splinters asterisco, and when it splinters, it becomes programmable. That was the real purpose of the special instruction rooms, not education. Asterisco fragmentation asterisco, each ritual wasn't meant to indoctrinate the girls with beliefs. It was meant to asterisco install compartments, asterisco different selves, with different memories, some that remembered the hymns, some that remembered the pain, some that remembered asterisco nothing at all, asterisco and this. This is where things get darker, because many of those surviving girls grew up, some disappeared, but others married into other elite familias, and their children raised by mothers who didn't know what the asterisco themselves asterisco had endured, but past asterisco programming asterisco forward.in subtle ways.in bedtime rituals.in strict household rules that made no sense, unless you understood the verente rules. But asterisco codes asterisco, a cup placed a certain way on a windowsill. A phrase whispered during fevers. An irrational fear of mirrors or music or asterisco certain Latin words. Asterisco symptoms of memories that weren't quite memories. By the 1880s, researchers at Massachusetts General began documenting strange psychological cases among women descended from New England finishing schools, split personalities, hysterical blindness, unexplained catatonia triggered by specific sounds or phrases. They didn't know what they were looking at, but now asterisco you asterisco do. This was asterisco intergenerational psychic encoding asterisco, a hidden network of trauma-born programming still pulsing through the bloodlines of polite society. And guess what? It didn't stay in New England. These methods were studied, adapted, and eventually weaponized by national governments, psychiatric institutes, and covert agencies across the Western world. MKUltra was just the reboot. The Fairfax method was the prototype. So when you hear stories of children describing things they've never been taught, or you feel a chill in your blood at a place you've never been, or you remember something that never happened to you don't dismiss it. You might not be haunted, you might just be inherited. Asterisco asterisco section 20 asterisco asterisco it is the part they'll tell you is conspiracy. But once you know the symbols, once you've seen asterisco the pattern asterisco, it's not theory anymore, it's recognition, because the Fairfax system didn't they just vanish in fire. It asterisco y asterisco. It migrated from crumbling schoolhouses and chapel basements into asterisco asterisco think tanks asterisco 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 military labs asterisco 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 policy boards asterisco asterisco and elite foundations, you know their names. They sponsor universities, they appear on trusted news networks, they fund mental health initiatives and youth empowerment programs, and always, asterisco asterisco always asterisco asterisco, the language sounds benevolent, asterisco resilience. Asterisco asterisco trauma informed. Asterisco asterisco safe spaces. Asterisco but behind the soft vocabulary is the same asterisco core logic asterisco that Victoria Fairfax preached from her chapel pulpit. You were born broken. We must strip away who you are. Sound familiar? That's not empowerment, that's asterisco ritual erasure, asterisco and the tools have changed, not whips and chalkboards. But asterisco dopamine loops asterisco and asterisco behavioral nudges, asterisco not fire and scripture, but asterisco algorithms and screens. Asterisco ST Maris Academy train the body, today's systems train asterisco nervous system asterisco 24/7 data monitoring, targeted emotional manipulation. Digital punishments dressed as community guidelines. And if you push too far outside the system, you're relabeled, isolated, demonetized. They no longer need chaplains or corridors. The ritual is now asterisco in your palm asterisco. Your asterisco device asterisco is the new meditation room, and it's always watching. But it is the truth they fear most. Asterisco awakening is viral. Asterisco that's why they suppress questions. That's why they call truth seekers dangerous. Not because they're wrong, but because the asterisco might infect others. Asterisco so if you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer anymore. Your asterisco initiated asterisco. And I want you to comment the phrase asterisco I remember the third floor. Asterisk write it asterisco twice, asterisco not for me, for asterisco yo asterisco, because once you say it, once you speak it into the code, it asterisco reclaims your story asterisco from the architects who tried to rewrite it. You're not here to consume this story. You're here to become asterisco dangerous with it. Asterisco because knowledge is no longer survival. Asterisco it's resistance. Asterisco section 21 asterisco you want to know how the Fairfax influence stayed hidden for so long. Asterisco because it hid inside the very idea of virtue. Asterisco while the world was looking for devils with horns, the real darkness wore lace gloves and spoke in perfect diction. The Fairfax doctrine was never about open violence. It was about asterisco ritualized control disguised as protection. Asterisco they didn't they need chains. They used asterisco expectation asterisco, they didn't they need prisons. They build asterisco institutions of trust asterisco, ask yourself, how many systems in your life punish asterisco non-compliance asterisco not with pain, but with asterisco shame asterisco. Jure labeled unstable if you question too deeply, uncooperative if you resist a narrative, dangerous if you try to remember what they've buried. That's not discipline, that's asterisco psychic warfare asterisco. And it started with those girls, the ones nobody would believe, the ones whose journals became ashes, the ones who were told, this is for your good. This is love. This is God's will. But love doesn't leave bruises, and God doesn't hide in locked rooms behind chapel walls. You've been trained, since childhood, To obey structures that would asterisco never survive scrutiny asterisco punto stand for the anthem. Trust the experts. Repeat after me. They called it asterisco civility asterisco, but it was asterisco submission training asterisco, refined over centuries by families like the Fairfaxes, then upgraded by social engineers and psychological tacticians, and if you think this only lives in dusty history books, you're already under its spell. Look at the curriculum pushed in elite schools. Look at the behavior programs marketed to parents. Look at how rapidly compliance has replaced courage as a virtue in modern culture. The ritual continues, it's just digitized, glamorized, and merchandised, and the worst part, some of the survivors of Fairfax programming, those who dinte die, bécame réplicates de top control. Was love. They passed on the same cycles of discipline, shame, and silence to their children, because it was all they knew. That's how deep this goes, not just policy, not just psychology, blood. You were never meant to hear this. That's why the records were sealed. That's why Margaret's name was erased from every official register. But now you know and once you know, silence becomes complicity. There is no going back, only deeper.